One of the biggest storylines all year was the rapid rollout of vote by mail, coupled with concerns over capacity, security, and the counting of those ballots. If you know Tammy Patrick, the senior advisor for elections at the Democracy Fund, you know that I did not have to twist her arm that much to moderate a panel about voting by mail. There's honestly no one better for the role, and Tammy, the panel is yours.
Thanks so much, Matt. We've seen already this morning with the fabulous snow globe from Dr. Stewart that when voters are given options in how and when to vote, they tend to move away from Tuesday, election day. And over the years, this has meant a growth in voters having their ballots handed to them by a postal carrier, not a poll worker. I often say that every election has a story to tell. And although we anticipated more vote by mail or absentee or voting at home in 2020, the impact of conducting an election in a global pandemic had dramatic impact on how and when and where voters voted. So we're going to hear from our distinguished panelists. I asked them to turn on their videos now and join us on the trends around vote by mail leading into 2020, what concerns election officials had, how they felt the election went, and then some of those lingering questions around the future of voting by mail. So let's begin with where we've come from and what we're expecting moving into this what we were expecting moving into this election cycle. So I want to introduce our panelists today. I'm going to keep it relatively brief. Their longer bios are in the information about the event today. But we're going to start with Tina Barton, who's the Rochester Hills, Michigan City Clerk. And we're also going to hear from Amber McReynolds, Executive Director of the Vote at Home Institute and former Denver Elections Director, Steve Trout, former Oregon State Elections Director, and Secretary Kim Wyman, the Washington State Secretary of State. So let's first start off with Amber, actually, and have a little bit of a conversation around what some of the national changes have been leading into 2020 and to this moment and the landscape of what we were expecting this year.
Well, thank you for inviting me to be a part of this panel. It's amazing to be with so many great friends and experts on this topic. First and foremost, vote by mail has been expanding for the last almost 3 decades, and that's a trend that we've been seeing happen across multiple states, primarily in the West, but certainly across the country. So this is not a suddenly new form of voting. It's been used for a long period of time, and it's been increasing because it provides a convenient and secure and accessible option for voters to vote. This year, the pandemic really exposed some of the significant vulnerabilities and resiliency issues that many states have with their reliance on one day of in-person voting. So we saw state officials and local officials really respond to what they expected to see, which was an increase in vote by mail, by trying to implement new ways of doing things, improvements on the existing vote by mail procedures and processes that they were doing. And we also saw legislators respond to some of these issues that came up this year, including in states that have traditionally resisted a lot of expansion in this area, namely New York, Connecticut, some of the states that we don't often talk about as it relates to voting access issues. So this really happened across the country, and there's a couple of things that states really did this year that I think we should all be celebrating in terms of successes. First, we saw an unprecedented number of states actually put the absentee request process online. So they made it more accessible for voters to request an absentee ballot. We also saw states enhance their ballot tracking capabilities. So giving voters an ability to either look up the information on the state portal website or going as far as many states did with expanding ballot tracking. And states like Georgia and Nevada, California all instituted statewide ballot tracking programs that included text and email notifications. A third thing that we saw happen was expansion of drop boxes. And that also has been proven to expand access to vote by mail while also enhancing security. And we saw, one of the results we saw of that was a reduction in the number of late ballots that we've seen in terms of percentage of postal ballots that are normally mailed, being able to drop them off in person, like what happened in many states, reduced the number of late ballots. And that's also a good thing that we saw. And then finally, vote by mail was used by more voters than we've ever seen before in any presidential election. And it was the most widely used form of voting when we consider election day voting, early voting, and then vote by mail. So it gave people options, it provided a safe option. And then we also saw people that are pretty happy with it now. And a lot of the polling data, people really liked their voting experience, and likely we'll see that expand even further.
Thank you so much. And there's so many things there that we're going to dig into the course of the panel, because when we looked at this year, Tina, I'd like to hear from you. You had a lot of changes moving into 2020, even before you knew that there was going to be a global pandemic that you were going to be managing as well. So I'd love to hear from you of how some of these major shifts occurred in Michigan and some of the challenges that you faced.
Thank you, Tammy. Again, it's as Amber mentioned, it's so great to be with all of you, and it's an honor to serve on this panel and to represent Michigan. So yeah, in November of 2018, the voters in Michigan resoundingly passed a ballot proposal 18-3 that really brought sweeping election reform to the state of Michigan, the way the access that voters had, as well as the way that voters could vote. For instance, we had same-day registration, things like automatic registration, and the straight party voting option. And one of the biggest changes that we saw that truly was the big game changer for us was no reason absentee voting. So prior to that, in Michigan, you had to provide a reason in order to obtain an absentee ballot. So with the no reason absentee voting, again, we saw immediately that this was going to become, not only did the voters choose to vote for this, but they also were going to choose to actually take part in it. And so August of 2019 was our first election in Rochester Hills to implement those changes from that proposal. And our very first election after that, we saw out of all of the ballots cast in our city, over 80% of them were done by absentee ballot. And that was the very first election for us to implement Proposal 18-3. It became abundantly clear to us then that this was going to bring about change throughout the whole state as we went into 2020. And keeping in mind too that a large percentage of the clerks in Michigan were very decentralized, with almost 1,600 of us, that the vast majority, a lot of them, were not going to implement these changes until 2020. Because most of the township clerks do not have elections in odd years unless there's a special election. So regardless of the pandemic, we were already looking at 2020 in Michigan saying, okay, basically everything that you have known prior to this has changed, and we have a new way of doing business here. So let's get it implemented. And we saw the voters respond, and I think the election officials across the state responded to what the voters wanted.
Well, it is one of those situations where, every election can be slightly different. And so even in a situation like in Michigan, where you had lots of change coming into this moment, Secretary Wyman, Kim, I'd like to move to you, because you've had vote by mail for years. And I'd love to hear from you what kind of changed this time around, and also play on a little bit of something that Director Wolf said. And she said, trust has grown locally. But in this moment, coming from a state that's had vote by mail for so long, you were really tapped quite frequently to talk about and comment on what vote by mail means, the security of it, the convenience of it, the integrity of it. And you had a bit of a national role in this moment, really educating the American electorate on what vote by mail means and whether or not they should trust it. So I'd love to hear your perspective on how things went, both in Washington and kind of the moment of the things that you talked about in the national on the national stage.
Oh, thanks, Tammy, and thanks to BPC for putting this day together. It's just so amazing to hear all of these speakers and the different perspectives, and it's so important, I think, as we move forward. It was interesting being part of Washington's ramp up. I think most of the people watching this know that Washington really had 10 years to ramp up to full-blown vote by mail, and as a state, we moved to that in 2011. So we had a lot of experience going into this election with vote by mail elections and vote at home. I should use the proper term with Amber McReynolds on the call. But even with that said, we went into this election with some pretty big change. We were implementing same day voter registration, automatic voter registration, 16 and 17-year-old pre-registration, and universal registration all at once in this presidential year. And I think what was interesting watching our counties, in our state, it's our county auditors who are the election officials at the local level. And even though they knew COVID was, front and center and it changed all of our operations, even though they knew that they had to ramp up some safe in-person voting opportunities, I don't think some of them really understood that you have to plan for 1 to 2% of your voters coming into your election office. And even though we talked about it ad nauseum, it really, for one of our counties in particular, election day, they realized the impact of that. And some of the plans they had made all worked out in the end, but it was really interesting, even though, on Friday before election day, we were really saying, run the numbers. What's 1% of your registered voter total, and how are you going to deal with those folks coming in on election day? It wasn't until about noon on election day that they really got it. And to their credit, they all adapted well. We didn't have lines in Washington, but we did see about 1 to 2% of our voters come in person to either register, get a new ballot, change their address. And I don't think our counties really got it until we were in the throes of the general election, what that really looked like and meant. But the other things we saw, we had prepaid postage for the first time in a presidential year. And oddly, our voters still chose to use drop boxes. We had over 500 ballot drop boxes for about 5 million registered voters across the state. And 72% of our voters returned their ballot in a drop box, even though we had prepaid postage. And I think a lot of that was because of the rhetoric that was coming out of the White House and the Republican Party in general about, voting by mail is not secure. And I think many of our voters did want to, make sure that their ballot got to election officials by giving it to them directly. But overall, I think what you saw across the country was remarkable. The fact that states like Pennsylvania and Michigan and Georgia, who had very, little history dealing with absentee ballots, were able to ramp up the scope and scale of their operations is just a testament to the election officials in those states, all of the states, quite honestly. I think, and I think the work at Vote at Home really did help with that, and getting the word out is just, it was a remarkable election, regardless of what people are saying.
Exactly. Exactly right. And so, Steve, I'd like to turn to you, because coming again from a state that was the first state to offer a vote at home or a vote by mail system in the country, I would love to hear your perspective as you saw this kind of rolling out across the time period of this year, because it's really started hitting in the primaries, and what we saw with the end, where all of these states were really having a condensed time period in which to ramp things up and scale.
Yeah, no, thanks. And thanks to BPC for hosting this to get good information out. We're all victims of misinformation, over time. But, as Secretary Wyman said, election officials throughout the country did a phenomenal job. And I think what we're missing too, though, is voters did a phenomenal job. Whenever there's change, that's hard. And we see that over time. And in Oregon, thankfully, it was really business as usual. And so the voters didn't have to learn anything new. But I remember back, post-HAVA, when people were moving away from punch cards into optical scans, and it was 2 or 3 election cycles when people were still punching holes through those ovals. And so, as I started talking with states and locals, back in early March, that was one of the things: is remember the voters in this. There's going to be a lot of change. We need to educate them, and they did a phenomenal job. And and I know in a lot of states, the legislation, the statutes, the rules, they just, they really didn't contemplate running a full, vote by mail election, and that's hard. We've been doing in Oregon exclusively elections vote by mail, for over 20 years now, but doing most of them for over a generation now. And so, every time there are lessons learned to try to, fine tune that process, and make the process better. And, I tried to share, I know Secretary Wyman and her team tried to share lessons learned and best practices with the other states. It was gratifying to see them, take those and run with them. I often felt like a proud dad. It's like, we've been telling these stories, and it's great to see people deliver and to come through and do such great jobs, and go into all those conferences where people would start to groan when Lori Gino and I would be talking about vote by mail, and now to hear them telling all the same stories is just it's awesome. But it's a credit to election administrators and to voters to be able to navigate these rapid changes in this time. And I think as we go forward, what's best for the voter is what we really need to focus on.
Well, that's the perfect segue, because what I really want to do now is dig into some of the ways in which we administer an election around vote by mail and how it was really turned into a partisan weapon in this moment. So, this year certainly provided a lot of examples of what some of the basic tenets of a successful vote by mail system are. So let's dig into some of those topics. I wanted to discuss the policies that really played out this year, given that in addition to the impacts of COVID, we saw large numbers of first-time voters having new options for the first time, and also voters turning to that absentee vote at home situation as a safe and healthy alternative that have never turned to it in these numbers before. So states that had single-digit participation rates, now 50, 60, 70%. And this caused a real need for voter education, information, as well as an environment that unfortunately was really ripe for mis and disinformation. So before the primaries even started, we saw the foundation being laid to call into question the security and integrity of voting by mail, of voting at home. And surveys of voters early in the year showed that 2/3 of the voters were saying they plan to vote by mail in the November election. Now, given all the rhetoric that we heard around the integrity of it, and then the changes that occurred with the Postmaster General at the Postal Service and calling into question whether or not USPS could deliver, we saw changes in those plans. And as we saw this morning, about half of our voters still ended up voting by mail. So I want to start first with applications for ballots and then mailing out ballots, talk about ballot returns, a little bit on ballot results before we wrap up in 20 short minutes. So when it comes to, I know it's so much to talk about. So ballot applications, this was something that was certainly weaponized around who can send them, whether a Secretary of State could send them in the primary, but then not in the general. Who gets one, that they go to everybody in a state, which we know isn't true. It's registered voters. What does it mean if you get more than one application? Does it mean you get lots of ballots, which was another misunderstanding that voters seem to have? How they could apply, when they could apply. Amber mentioned the online application processes that more states adopted. And then what some of those challenges were with just literally getting the applications into the system. So Tina, I'd love to start with you, because you saw in this moment, your voters had the opportunity to not have to have an excuse or provide a reason in this moment. So I'd love to hear what that impact was, both on your office in the primary, what lessons you learned and shifted into the general, or if things just went completely perfectly and it was all planned out, even though there were so many unknowns.
Yeah, so one of the things that we have here in Michigan is a permanent AV application list. And so prior to every election, anybody who is already on that list is requested to be on it. They could be sent an application for the upcoming election. We also have a dual application in a cycle like what we had with the August and the November general election, where someone could fill out that application and apply for their primary, their August primary, and their November general ballot at the same time. So we normally send those out around the end of May. The Secretary of State chose then at that time to send an application out to anyone who was a registered voter in Michigan who was not already on that list. And as you mentioned, it became political and it was challenged. And the Michigan Court of Appeals did affirm the fact that the Secretary is the chief election official for the state of Michigan and had the right and the ability to send out those applications. So we saw our AV ballot base immediately increase. at that time. And the other thing that we have noticed with all of those applications coming back, so not only did it mean that we were having more people apply for an absentee ballot, but on that application is a box that says, please sign me up for permanent absentee applications for future elections. So we saw an extremely high percentage of these applications coming back for individuals saying, hey, I may not have been on that list in the past, but I want to be on this list for all future elections. So I can see what we have looked at here in Michigan is we have gone in a 2-year time period, really from needing a reason to no reason to extremely high turnout to I see us organically becoming more of a voted home state now, based off of the reactions that we saw from voters requesting to be on this permanent AV application list. Keeping in mind that, you know, at a 70% approval on this proposal, Michiganders want to do this, and they are going to do this. And I do see this changing for us ongoing as we move forward.
And Amber, I know you are a big fan of at least having a permanent list as another step in the evolution, the stages of following what the voters want. And so I'd love to hear your perspective on what you saw around the application process this year.
Sure. Well, and as Tina just mentioned, I mean, the big thing is voters get to decide what method of voting they want. It's not up to politicians. It's not up to the president or governors or senators or anything. It's really they get to decide which option. And you know, they've made that choice this year, which is very clear that voters want options before Election Day, and many of them are choosing vote by mail. You won't be surprised to hear me say that the application process in most states is basically bureaucracy on steroids, especially in the states where you have to make the request every single cycle. So in some states that meant 3 applications this year that had to get submitted for 3 different elections. And that puts a huge burden on election officials to process all of that data entry, especially when it's paper applications that take that extra time. So we saw actually, you know, there's sort of the election process, and then there's the data entry and some of these things that happened before. We saw huge backlogs in many states of these applications. And so I think there's, again, opportunity for modernization, creating at least once a year you can sign up for all future. We certainly like and prefer things like what Arizona has, which is the permanent list for everyone. You can sign up for all future elections unless you either move or decide you don't want it anymore. And that just really eliminates some of that administrative bureaucracy that so many states still have on the books. I think the other real opportunity is for the online application piece that certainly came up this year. It's an accessibility issue. We've been saying that quite a bit. Some voters need to have that to either for language or other things that might provide barriers to them. So continuing to build that out is a very important next step for this type of reform. And again, whatever we can do to eliminate the bureaucracy, I think is really important. And frankly, you know, the Michigan example is a good one, and many secretaries of state sent applications out, and it's their constitutional duty to inform the public about their voting options. So absolutely, it's their responsibility. And the other thing I always say about this is if election officials don't send the information, third-party groups are going to do it, and they're going to repeatedly do it, so that there's lots of duplicate applications. So I think there is a better way that we can approach all of this to take down the bureaucracy, take down the administrative burdens, and frankly, take down the costs for election officials as they're going about their duties.
And there were 5 additional states in this moment that did away with the application process and said, you know what, you applied when you registered to vote. That's when you told us you wanted to vote. So in this global pandemic, we're going to go ahead and send out ballots to all of our registered voters. So not only did we have the standard 5, you know, the others in addition to Oregon and Washington, but we had some others that joined in those ranks. So we had more states sending out ballots themselves to registered voters than ever before. And I'd love to hear from both Steve and Kim about what you saw as changes kind of before Election Day, because you weren't dealing with all of those applications. But Secretary Wyman, you had mentioned the voter registration, you know, changes that you were dealing with. There were also questions in this moment with so many more people moving to a vote by mail situation, that there'd be, you know, challenges with supplies and with machinery and the supply chain and with the postal service. So I'd love to hear from the two of you as as kind of the stalwarts of voting by mail and having those systems for a while, what was different this year before Election Day? Or was it just a well-oiled machine? And we'll move on to the next question.
Oh, no, I think Steve and I were doing the no after you. No, I insist after you. Yeah, in Washington, it was interesting because we were doing all of these new initiatives in a new to a presidential year with voter registration and not really knowing what that was how that was going to impact things. I think the biggest change for our same day law, we do allow address changes up till 8 days before Election Day. And of course, I think many of the people on this call know that election officials are starting to run their list and getting their mail out ready 30 days or more before Election Day. So, you know, that point in time where you actually say, this is our official list, we're mailing out ballots, every change that happens in that window between 30 days and 8 days is going to result in a second ballot being sent to voters potentially. And then of course, all of the changes in person made between 8 days and Election Day are going to result in a second ballot going to voters or more. And so this became a real focus for the critics of vote by mail. And I think a lot of it, again, was fueled by some of the rhetoric coming out of the Trump campaign and coming out of conservative circles. And so suddenly we found ourselves as election officials, particularly in our general election, really getting an assault on social media of, you know, oh my God, people got 2 ballots. You know, this is the end of the world. It's rampant voter fraud. And then they just kind of snowballed from there. You know, we know that households are getting more than 1 ballot that of people that don't live there any longer in, you know, condominiums and apartments. And, you know, so the rhetoric kind of ramped up online. And I think it was just mirroring a lot of the talk that was happening nationally. And so we really found ourselves trying to combat it with the facts. We were using our statewide voter registration database and election management system called VoteWA for the first time in a presidential year. It went live in 2019. And of course, like any new technology, had some bumps on the way. But I can tell you that all of those were worth it, because when we got into the general election cycle, our counties had an interconnected system that was near live time. So all of our registrations that we were processing, we were verifying the IDs before we could count ballots that were issued. We were able to confidently know that only 1 ballot was going to be counted, no matter how many ballots we sent to voters. And so I think our election officials on the front lines in our counties really had a higher confidence level that that this was going to be a well-run election. And we just kind of stayed on message at the state and with our county partners. It didn't matter in terms of social media, but it certainly mattered in their ability to reconcile the election. And I think, we're going to be reviewing some of those laws and looking at whether forwarding ballots is a good idea in our state. We had probably, and I'm trying to remember the data, but just election week, the 2 weeks leading into election, we had 55,000 new registrations that were processed, and of course, many more that were address changes. So, we're going to kind of evaluate maybe rolling back our forwarding of ballots so that we cut down on that number of ballots that's actually out there in play. Our counties are going to have to do the address changes anyway. So, we're kind of tweaking and fine tuning our system coming out of the election. But I think what we've heard, Tina and Amber talk about and Megan Wolf on one of the earlier panels, I think that there's a lot of misinformation and people just don't understand what election officials do. And that's where I think we really need to spend our time, is kind of, presenting the facts and presenting the administrative side to inspire confidence in the electorate.
Steve?
Yeah, and just real quickly, I mean, it really was business as usual, and I felt guilty being on calls because all we had to deal with was COVID. All these other changes and everything we didn't have to deal with. Where we really did see a difference was on the back end. Ballots came in earlier than they ever have, and that was a huge benefit because kind of in the COVID world, flattening the curve. We were able to have more ballots processed earlier, more reported when the polls closed, and even my big counties went home at midnight or 1 in the morning, And that never happens. They're always there, and it's election day is a 2 sunrise day. So even the bigger counties were able to go home earlier because those ballots came in earlier, flatten the curve, and they were able to process those and get ready. And so, relatively speaking, election day was boring.
Well, I love that because that's the perfect segue. First of all, that election day is a 2 sunrise day is fabulous, but it's the perfect segue into that conversation around ballots being returned. And we know that it was called into question this year on whether or not, you could have drive-through voting, which in Iowa was being championed as this great thing where you could drive through, you could drop off back ballots. Whereas in other states like Texas, that was being challenged in court. And so when it comes to those ballot returns, where the drop boxes were placed, the collection methods, and whether or not there was, chain of custody, that made those protocols, made it into headlines and court dockets all across the country. Not always accurately, but they were there. So Steve, let's start with you. And, requiring ballots to be returned by the close of the polls on election day versus ballots coming back in with a postmark or postal indicia was certainly a topic this year. So I'd love to hear your thoughts around that.
One thing that I really want to focus on here is let's let the data, let's look at the data and let that drive. And I think changing things on voters is where you start to see fall off. Ballots rejected in Oregon for arriving too late is very small. I mean, it's like 0.24%. Ballots that come in without a signature, 0.35, 0.4%, signature mismatches, 1%. So that's really where the focus should be on those things. But I think as people talk about all of these policy choices, and these are all policy choices, as legislators look at that, let's look at the data, let's talk to the election experts, which are the election administrators, and find out how this is working, because it's part of a continuum. And there was talk here in Oregon about going to postmarks like in September, but only changing that. And I truly believe that would have resulted in more ballots not being counted, because that would limit the time people have to cure. And because signature mismatches and non-signatures are a much bigger universe of reasons why ballots are rejected, it would do that. So if you're going to change these timelines, and that's a policy decision for policymakers on in-hand versus postmark, but let's look at the data and also look at the entirety of the elections calendar and how that impacts things, and how that impacts certification, and how that impacts the number of ballots that are going to be the results that are going to be reported on election night. And because frankly, Washington State with postmark deadlines rejects more historically over the last couple cycles for being too late than Oregon does where it's in hand. And it's still a very small percentage.
Right. And that's the rejection rate is certainly something that was a big conversation this year. And Secretary Wyman, you had mentioned that you went to prepayment of postage for return ballots, but that voters tended to use the drop boxes as they have in the past. But I'm curious, because it seems like across the country, we did see voters returning their ballots earlier than in past years, and that was very helpful. But I'm curious, when it comes to the ballot return in Washington, did you feel it was a good step forward to do the prepayment, particularly because not a lot of voters used it, so it wasn't a large expenditure, but it was an option for those who needed it? Or what is your kind of take on the return of the ballots and how that all worked out?
Well, I think, one of the good things about prepaid postage is it kind of takes away one more barrier. So it's one more thing. I apologize if my connection is getting bad. You all are coming through kind of garbled, so I think it's my connection. But, what we saw was a real shift in behavior. And I think some of that had to do with the narrative of the USPS. I think prepaid postage is a good thing because it removes that barrier and that argument. So typically we see half of our ballots come in election week. And as Steve pointed out, we have a postmark requirement in Washington State. And I would just slightly argue a little bit differently. The states that have a cutoff of in the door 8 p.m., I don't think ever report how many ballots come in through with a late postmark as their rejected ballots. I think that they just stopped looking at them. So I'm not sure that our late postmark data, I think, works against us because we capture it. But arguably, I'm concerned about trying to shift to an Oregon model, even though I get a lot of pressure to do that, because our voters are used to that postmark cutoff, and we see ballots in a typical election. We see as many ballots come in Wednesday as came in on Tuesday in a typical election, and we would be disenfranchising hundreds of thousands of voters if we cut off that receipt on 8 o'clock election night for the first few years until they got used to it. So I'm very hesitant to shift over, but again, policy discussion, and if my legislature wants to do that, we'll certainly accommodate it. Beyond that, we saw this weird shift of 72% of our ballots were returned by Dropbox. Going into the election, this 2020 election year, it was actually 50-50. So we'll see how it goes in the future. This year, 80% of our ballots were received before election day or by election day. Again, that's a new trend. We normally don't see that. So we're going to kind of just watch the trends post 2020. But I think that everything that we can do to give voters choices and enfranchise them is a good thing. And hopefully you do it all.
Yeah. Amber and Tina, let's talk a little bit about the return process, some of the things that that happen between the ballots coming back in and the reports going out, because we know we never have final results on election night, but boy, oh boy, this year there was sure a lot of conversation around what was happening. And even though those who have been, watching this for years know that when the polls close, the media usually projects and predicts who will be the winner when all the ballots are counted. But we still need to count all the ballots. So I would love to hear from you. Tina, let's start with you, because there was a lot of conversation around when you could process ballots. So I'd love to hear from you about, the ballot return process and some of the challenges that you faced that you knew going into this moment would be a challenge, but it didn't seem like people were listening to the degree that maybe they should have.
Well, obviously, some of the challenges that we were having was sheer volume, right? A higher volume than we had ever seen. We were, another challenge would be that we had people voting absentee for the first time. So with that volume meant that a lot of them were first time voters. In returning that, we did see we had some challenges with the postal service, people we had sent absentee ballots to not receiving them. So we had to spoil those ballots, send out a second ballot. We also experienced a large number of our people, even though we offered prepaid postage, of them bringing their ballots in person. And even though we did offer more ballot drop boxes across the state of Michigan than ever before, a lot of people, even here in Rochester Hills, we had one in our city hall parking lot. And that wasn't good enough, even though it was secured and under camera and under a light and bolted down. They still wanted to walk physically into the building and hand their ballot over. And we saw more people than ever doing that because of the rhetoric that had been going on regarding absentee ballot not being safe, or the postal service saw your ballot and they thought you were a certain party, they were going to destroy your ballot. And there were all these rumors out there, and people really felt like, I have to physically deliver this to you in person so that I can make sure that my ballot is going to count. We also saw challenges with processing time. If, as we were looking at that, Amber worked with us. This was something that we were working on for over a year with our legislature, to get them to understand that we needed to meet what Proposal 18.3 had brought us, the no reason absentee. We needed changes that were going to give us and arm us with the tools to successfully process this election, and to do so using reports like the Bipartisan Policy Center's recommendations, that we needed more than just election day to open, process, and handle the 3.3 million absentee ballots that came in to the state of Michigan. And we needed more time to do that. We got a little sliver of time that we were allowed to at least open the envelopes, but it wasn't enough. It won't be enough moving forward. And I hope our legislature took a look at what happened in November and said, we missed the mark on that, and we need to do better in the future, because I know there are going to be individuals like me, there are going to be individuals like Amber that will be reminding them that this is what we need to do moving forward. We need more time.
Well, and on that point, Amber, if you could also position us moving forward? How to we recover from all of this and get back on track?
Yeah, well, I think first and foremost is, state legislative bodies as well as at the federal level need to listen to election officials when we're talking about policy changes. I mean, these issues that, Tina just outlined, and then Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and New York all had similar issues where they did not start processing until election day or after, are problematic. And that is something like we've been pushing for this. There's a minority of states that have this issue, but none of those states listened to the election officials that were requesting this procedural and technical change for more than a year. And exactly what happened, we all said would happen. And I think the other thing that all of this highlights, really the discussion we just had about postmarks and boxes and prepaid postage and not, the sort of disinformation campaign that's been running has been a lot easier to run because of the disparities and the differences by state. And yes, states should run elections, but we need to have a serious conversation about more national minimum standards for some of these things to frankly address the disinformation and misinformation that continues to run rampant throughout the country because everything is so different. It's easy to do. It's easy to confuse people because all the rules are so different. Again, balancing states run elections, but still, what are the minimum rights and standards that voters can have access to in states so that there isn't so much disinformation? I think the second big thing is, again, listen to local election officials and state officials on the technicalities, the data-driven policy approaches that Steve mentioned. We need to pay attention very specifically to the fact that most voters chose to vote a mail ballot. Most voters also voted before Election Day this year. So that means we need to look at early voting structures and make sure we've got the right systems in place to support that. And then what did voters do? Did they return by mail? Did they return by Dropbox? How did they interact with the system? Because that's the only way we can really design systems that put voters first, meet voters where they are, and also rebuild trust in the process by looking at those very specific data points on this process and relying on experts that actually do this work, not those that are just spewing conspiracies and disinformation that isn't accurate.
Absolutely. Well, I want to thank our panelists. I have 782 additional questions that we could talk about for the next 10 hours. But sadly, our time is up. At this point, we will be going to a break. So again, I want to thank our panelists, thank the Bipartisan Policy Center for giving us this platform to talk about the challenges that we've faced this year, both as the American electorate as well as election officials, and continue to resound the message that our elections are safe, they're secure, they're accessible, and we should all have faith in the outcomes of those elections. And when you have concerns or questions, you should definitely reach out to election officials, get involved, be a poll worker, volunteer your time as an observer, and find out for yourself the security that is the bedrock of our foundation of our democracy. So we will now have a break and we'll be back, I believe, in 8 to 10 minutes. Thank you all.